and welcome to episode 47 of the Clacks Women for Independence podcast. We're having a bit of a poetical episode this week, partly to celebrate the milestone 50th birthday of one of the Clacks Women for Indie, also known as Lorraine, our new poet. So we're going to be featuring some of Lorraine's best work and wishing her a very happy birthday from all of us. Happy birthday! And here's Lorraine's very first poem called Universe, Earth, Mother.
Dear Universe, please this year send me a sign to help me find my soulmate for the sake of auld lang syne. But if no sign is shown, then I know I have to do this alone. For I have a mission and a goal. My mission is to secure for my country self-determination for the preservation of this great sovereign nation. My goal is to save the planet and not rely on coal, eliminate toxins with greener lifestyles that nourish the soul. Dear Earth, please help Scotland be brave and take independence. The Earth's dying whilst politicians are lying. We must act now, of that there is no denying. Dear Mother Nature, please help us to understand and nourish you more, for you provide all nature's wondrous beauty that I truly do adore. It has surely got to be this generation's destiny to leave a healthier planet as our ancestral legacy for our children.
And the other exciting thing that happened this week, GERS Week, the annual release of the most debated stats in Scotland, possibly the UK. I think we've mentioned before on this podcast, we are big fans of Dr. Craig DL, the policy director of the Commonweal. Not only does he have a gift for explaining complicated subjects in very easy to understand ways, I think he coined the phrase GERSMAS, and he always covers it in his blog at the Common Green. For the last couple of years, he's also been doing a poem. Clacks WFIs love poetry, and we often take poems and put them to music and play them on our Poetry and Jazz show on Indie Live Radio on a Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock. Now, this year's poem, Craig has done a tribute, let's call it, to Wham, and it's called Last GERSMAS. Now, we would love to put that to music, but unfortunately, if we tried accompanying it with the Wham soundtrack, I think we would be done for copyright infringement. So we've looked through Craig's back catalogue, and we found the one that he wrote in 2017, which is called The Night Before GERSMAS. And I love this poem because it perfectly sums up the anticipation you feel the night before the big event. So we've set this one to some rather lovely copyright-free music by Mew. So let's get in the mood for GERSMAS. 'Twas the night before GERSMAS, and all through Scotland the bloggers were screeving their time near at hand. The headlines were crafted with doom and despair, in hopes that Lord Darling soon would be there. The MPs were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of oil money gushed through their heads. And Brown with his spreadsheet and Mackay who'll fudge it had just settled accounts and balanced the budget, when outside the office there came such a racket, they wondered if Ewing had started to frack it. Away to the window they flew with a boom, tore open the curtains and peered through the gloom at the moon's silver rays shining down on the hill and to the city below, feeling night's chill, when to wondering eyes what should appear but a BBC news van and crew full of cheer, with a silver-haired guest inaudibly mumbling. They knew right away, of course it's Lord Darling. More rapid than eagles his press team they came, and he hopped and he danced and he called them by name. MacDougall and Dugdale, Murdo and Bailey, Cole, Hamilton, Tompkins, Mundell and Kelly. To the top of the land and down to the wall, reports on the figures mention them all. So into the GERS book they buried their heads to find all the deficits, losses and debts. Armed with his story, Darling's smile grew. He turned to the news team, brows glittering with dew. The case for independence has suffered a blow. Sturgeon's day job is waiting, she's not doing it, you know. Brown and Mackay drew back from the eve. What they were hearing they could scarcely believe. The GERS figures weren't that bad, of this they were sure, and just from the right angle they had a certain allure. We can fix it, they said, going back to their books. We just need someone who can tease out the hooks, who can quote all our numbers with a laugh and a joke, and is just simply all round a capital bloke. If only we had the levers of power, we could do so much better. It'd be fixed in an hour. But there's good in here too. Just look at this line. Ignore that projection, you can always have mine. And so all throughout GERSMAS the racket went on, each side blaming the other right through till the dawn. And by the end of the day, nothing was solved. Scotland remained with powers barely devolved. And outside the bubble, the public still snoozing, scarcely aware of the political bruising, which repeated each year almost without fail, and which kept those inside it hearty and hale. So to we who have chosen this life political, I offer a toast and don't mean to be critical. Whether tomorrow brings you good news or else, Merry GERSMAS to all, just don't write for yourselves. So what are people saying about GERSMAS this year? Let's start right at the top with Holyrood.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's government expenditure and revenue Scotland figures show that Scotland has a fiscal deficit of £15 billion and rising. But the figures also show how much we need active government and how much it can do. It shows the value of tax-funded public services. Scottish Labour's greatest concern is ensuring. So, can I ask the First Minister again, will she join with us to pressure the UK government to extend the job retention scheme? And will she commit to a quality Scottish job guarantee scheme?
First Minister.
Again, I don't know where Richard Leonard has been for the last few weeks. I've been asking the UK government to continue the furlough job retention scheme almost every day for weeks. So I'm glad that Richard Leonard has now decided to back that call. In addition to that, the Scottish Government has also set out plans for a youth jobs guarantee scheme, and we'll set out more detail of that in the coming days and weeks. But, you know, I have to say, Richard Leonard is capable of still surprising in this chamber, because I didn't think it would be him today that stood up to extol the virtues of Scotland being governed by a Conservative Westminster government. I thought that might come from the other side of the chamber. You know, the thing is, the furlough scheme is funded by the UK government borrowing money. And the reason that they borrow that money and do it for us is because we don't have the powers here to do it ourselves. And what I would say to Richard Leonard is this: just use your imagination, right? And imagine Scotland was independent right now. He wouldn't have to be asking me to plead with a UK government to borrow more money to extend the job retention scheme. We could do it ourselves here in Scotland, like other independent countries the world over. And you know, it's probably that conclusion that has led to the situation we have right now, where almost a half of Richard Leonard's remaining Labour supporters, a dwindling band of people, I grant you, but almost a half of them now support Scotland becoming an independent country.
Richard Leonard.
Well, the First Minister will need to answer the question about where she is going to make up that £15 billion deficit, and where she is going to find, and where she is going to find the £100 billion it will take to set up the separate Scottish currency that she now says she wants. This public health and economic crisis, so will the First Minister commit today to use this Parliament's powers to ban evictions until the next Parliament?
First Minister.
We've already, I think I did it last week or it might have been the week before, but I've already stood here and said that we will extend the protection against evictions in the original coronavirus legislation for an additional 6 months. So, you know, again, Richard Leonard really needs to keep up with announcements as they are made by this government. I'm afraid I don't have the luxury of going at his pace on these things. We have to power ahead and get these things completed. Can I say to Richard Leonard, I will, in the programme for government, in the budgets that come, we will use our powers and our resources to the fullest effect possible. But if we had the powers and the resources that other independent countries right now have at their disposal, we wouldn't be in the position of facing what are the two biggest threats to Scotland's jobs right now. Firstly, it's the withdrawal of the jobs retention scheme. If we were independent, we wouldn't have to be going cap in hand to the UK government pleading with them to continue it. We could do it ourselves. The other big threat is a no-deal Brexit at the end of this year. If we were independent, we wouldn't have to face that prospect either. And can I say to Richard Leonard, you know, really aping the Tories on using GERS, which is a reflection of Scotland's fiscal position within the United Kingdom, not a reflection of how Scotland would fare as an independent country. But talking about deficits, at a time when the UK deficit is projected next year to be almost £400 billion, and at a time when the UK debt has just topped £2 trillion, is not the strongest territory for the Tories to be on, but it seems like politically suicidal territory for Labour to be on.
It's hard not to feel sorry for Richard Leonard these days, isn't it? But his salvation is in his own hands. I think if he were to create a Scottish registered Labour Party and work towards an independent Scotland, the Labour Party could actually have a very useful perspective to offer. But unless that penny drops, it's hard to see them doing anything other than dwindling away, which is actually very sad when you think of their history over the last 100 years or so. However, in their own hands. And ITV Borders didn't fare any better when they tried tackling Kate Forbes about it.
Across the world, countries operate with deficits. That's
not as
new.
big as this one.
It's not
Most
radical.
of them not as big as this one.
Actually,
8%?
on the contrary, we have just seen unprecedented borrowing from countries around the world, small and large countries, including the UK government, whose deficit is set to rise to £372 billion this year. I don't see any of those countries suddenly deciding that they no longer want to be independent. The difference between them and Scotland is that they have the powers and the levers to manage a deficit. Those are powers that we could use in order to invest in the economy and to manage our public finances far more sustainably than they are currently managed under this arrangement.
And were Scotland independent, it would take a share of that UK deficit and it would add the deficit that we know it has. So the deficit in an independent Scotland will be even higher than the UK deficit.
But at the moment, across the world, countries, large and small, are running significantly large deficits. None of them are suggesting that they should no longer be independent. What they do say is they need the powers to manage that deficit. If we had those powers, we would do the same.
STV Borders reporter there suggesting that we would take a share of the UK's deficit if we were independent. So delighted at being able to run down Scotland that he's got his deficit and his debts mixed up there a bit. Absolute nonsense. And Professor Richard Murphy, who, as you probably know, has done a series of very helpful little videos on YouTube about various aspects of independence and finance, was on the Wee Ginger Duck podcast this week. It was a really good podcast episode, and I know it's available on SoundCloud, so treat yourselves and go and have a listen to the whole thing. But I'm just going to give you a little taster of what Richard Murphy's got to say about the GERS this year.
I call them crap because they are completely rubbish approximations to the truth. Even if we overcome the fact that on the spend side, there is still a very large number of estimates on what is actually charged to Scotland from England, which makes up about 40% of the total expenditure, and therefore is just estimated. And if we look on the income side, there are still some very large numbers that are estimated, like value-added tax, which is based on some algorithms, and we know how great algorithms have been. And I was looking at all this and saying, I don't believe this data's right. So I started off really worrying about the estimates and saying, frankly, this didn't withstand any degree of scrutiny for that reason. And then I went a bit deeper into it and realised that actually the numbers were worse than that. Actually, GERS looks at government income in Scotland, but government expenditure for Scotland. They are different. Government income in Scotland is the amount of tax now paid to Revenue Scotland and the estimate of the taxes paid to HM Revenue and Customs for the UK as a whole, which might be appropriate to Scotland. And that covers a lot of taxes, VAT and capital gains tax and corporation tax and inheritance tax and a whole load of other things are all estimates. So there's a lot of figures in there which we don't know are necessarily right. But that's what is believed to be paid in Scotland. But then when we talk about expenditure for Scotland, that obviously is what actually the Scottish government spends. And of course, a large part of expenditure in Scotland is now devolved. I'm not arguing that. It's around 60% of government expenditure in Scotland. But that leaves 40%, which is based upon the rest of the UK. And that's still estimated. But the critical point about it was that this is the UK government deciding, now, you're going to pay for this, even if it doesn't actually have any relevance to Scotland. But what they don't do is on all that expenditure, which is not necessarily in Scotland, because it isn't necessarily in Scotland at all, they don't allocate the tax paid by the people who undertake that work back to Scotland. So what happens is we get large quantities of expenditure charged to Scotland, which is offset against income arising in Scotland, but without the tax to balance the equation being put right. So there is, by design, by default, or simply because they don't care, I don't care which version you want to put it as, a deficit built into this. If Scotland's deficit was really 3%, and the UK's deficit as a whole was really 3%, that isn't what GERS would tell you simply because of the way it's designed. Scotland would have a much bigger deficit than the rest of the UK because it isn't given credit for up to 40% of the tax paid on the expenditure for its benefit. And that's wrong. That's just blatantly wrong. And to me, that is by far the most likely reason why we come up with this complete nonsense that Scotland is the place in Europe with the biggest possible deficit. It outdoes Romania in terms of managing to run a deficit according to this data. No, it doesn't. I mean, it has been improved, I don't pretend otherwise, but it still has these massive flaws in it. And we don't know how big they are. I think that actually what GERS shows is the amount by which Scotland might be subsidising the rest of the UK. Scottish expenditure has been remarkably stable over a period of 20 years. Around 9% of the UK total expenditure. The story is, of course, that Scottish national income has gone down since 2010-11. And everyone says that's down to oil. Two things happened around that time. One was, we know oil began, or actually three things happened. One was oil began to decline. 2 was oil taxation was slashed to the point where it's virtually become non-existent, which is not true in other countries which take oil out of the North Sea, of course.
Yeah.
And so why was it decided suddenly that it was okay to give away Scottish revenues? A purely political decision by the government in London. Nothing to do with Scotland at all. And third, there was a financial crisis, which we probably all noticed, which certainly was not created on Scottish soil. And, HBOS by then was actually, the Bank of Scotland was now Halifax Banks of Scotland. And Halifax hasn't been in Scotland ever. And, it was a British bank. It was an English bank by then. And Royal Bank of Scotland was, of course, by then dominated by National Westminster and was basically based in London. So it was an English bank. And so you can't claim it was Scottish banks that fell over at that point of time. It was English banks that fell over. All of them fell over. And that was a London-created crisis in this context. And yet, of course, that created massive deficits in the whole of the UK. And the costs of those were dumped back onto Scotland.
Yeah.
The crisis in the southeast of England, in London, gave rise to massive costs, which were then dumped back into Scotland by the government in London, who then said, oh, you're terrible people, you can't manage your budget. And by the way, it said the same thing to Wales. And frankly, Northern Ireland picked up some apportioned costs too. In fact, England does all right, but it's all the Celtic fringes who cause all the problems.
Yeah, I think it's something like 54% of the entire UK deficit is supposedly the fault of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Well, some years it's been more than that. It's just bad accounting. And I'll tell you, I'm a chartered accountant. Accountants can, fix the books to make things look as they want, because we can. In cost accounting, which is what we're talking about here, we actually have to use formulas to allocate costs to places. Well, if you actually use the wrong formula to allocate costs, you end up with nonsense. And I believe that's what's happening here. I honestly believe that the failure of the income side of the equation in Jersey is also a fix. The defence is, but all the tax paid in Scotland is accounted for. Yeah, but is all the income that is due to Scotland subject to Scottish taxation, is my answer to that one. My friends and colleagues in the Tax Justice Network, they did some great work on this. They looked at actually PFI and other arrangements in Scotland and pointed out that, and Scotland has, as we know, had far too many of these arrangements because it's been denied the opportunity to borrow in any other way. And all this income, which is paid as forms of fees and in forms of interest and service charges and you name it, through intensely complicated corporate structures, ends up being accounted for anywhere but in Scotland. Yeah. So Scotland records this enormous excess cost for running its public services, which generates an income in the corporate sector which is taxed in London or, frankly, in Jersey or Cayman, or not taxed in Jersey and Cayman, of course. But the income is not recorded in Scotland. But there's also rents, because if a landlord in Scotland is resident in England, they'll pay tax in England, even though the rent obviously arises really in Scotland. Aye. And there's no adjustment for that. And there's also corporate profits. We have no clue what the true corporate profits arising in Scotland are. There's only 2 really large companies in Scotland, and all the rest are, banks and supermarkets and you name it, who are, have their profits guessed as a split between UK and Scotland. So this split is completely unknown. Now, there's a mechanism for actually finding this out. It's called country by country reporting, but it doesn't apply between England and Scotland. So we don't know whether the income recorded in Scotland is right. We don't know the true imports and exports from Scotland either. Now, it could be that Scotland exports more than it imports. It's entirely possible, because Scotland is a very different economy from the rest of the UK, and it has some very strong export products there, and I believe they're going to get stronger, by the way. Independence, one of the great things about independence is how strong Scotland is relative to the rest of the UK. Just it's got so many natural resources now which are going to be in demand, in particular energy. I see Scotland as the Saudi Arabia of Europe for the future.
I believe it's a quarter of the total wind energy potential for the whole of Europe.
Precisely.
A quarter of the tidal energy as well. For this.
These are the cheapest energy resources in Europe now, so there's going to be people who want to buy them to substitute for their expensive products elsewhere, including England right next door. So, there's lots of reasons why this income is wrong. But once we begin to add up all these things which are recorded outside Scotland, you can't say that the tax paid in Scotland is right. All you can say is the tax paid on the income declared in Scotland is right, but actually the income declared in Scotland is understated as well. Right. So not only have we got the potential costs overstated, and we haven't got the credit for the tax on those costs credited to Scotland, we also have the income in Scotland understated, so the tax paid on that income in Scotland isn't the full tax that's owing in Scotland. So every single figure that you look at, you find is biased against Scotland.
Let's have another poem from The Birthday Girl, and this one is one of my favourites. It's Paul Colvin, the indie poet, wrote it. This is Lorraine reciting Mother Tongue.
He said, "I'll give you silver," then said, "I'll give you gold." But the old man scoffed and said to him, "I will not sell my soul." This soul cannot be bought by you. What can't you understand? What you see is my true love. I am married to this land. The love I always wanted is here in front of me, and no amount of traitor's coin will let me be more free. Then the old man stooped down slowly and lifted up some earth. What I hold in this hand of mine is more than you are worth. For what I see before me is what you've torn apart. You've spilled the blood of innocence, and this here is their heart. I'm not too long for dying, but you'll see me again. I'll be on every path you take, and on every hill and glen. In wilderness I'll haunt you, my voice will fill the night, and those voices that you silenced will cry out with all their might. Each thistle that you walk by, each blade of grass you trod, will hear the voices rising, even from the barren sod. Beware the Plaids enchanters and the Gaelic that you stole. They're coming now to seek you out, and will bring with them their soul. Our culture and our history that you buried isn't dead. Scotland has awakened, and her story's being read. Lift your ears and hear the pipes. Her songs are being sung, but you won't understand them. They're sung in our mother tongue.
Now you might remember that before the pandemic struck, we had been following the developments at the Citizens' Assembly. The Assembly had met on 4 weekends, and in that time they'd covered their vision for Scotland. They'd looked at the Constitution in terms of where power lies rather than the independence question, sustainability, and they'd also had a look at tax and finance. And my main recollection of those two things struck me: how much similarity there was in the ambitions of the people there, and they very much, their top priority for investment, for example, was the NHS. And until the last meeting on tax, I had actually been very impressed with how information was being presented in a very even-handed, neutral way to allow people to consider it themselves. The fourth meeting, when they discussed tax and finance, was disappointing, and I'll come back to the issues I had with that in a moment. However, there were 2 meetings left of the original 6, and they were suspended, obviously, because of the coronavirus. But just checking their website, they are looking as if they're going to reconvene in September. I mean, the website is citizensassembly.scot if you want to have a look at any of this. It's got all the material from all the previous weekends. They've also asked the speakers to reconsider the information they presented before the pandemic in the light of the pandemic. And those little catch-up videos are actually really helpful. It's just a very brief summary of what was discussed and what difference they think the COVID has made. However, as I said, I do have issues with the way they covered budget and tax. There were 2 speakers selected to give the Assembly information on Scotland's financial position. One came from Audit Scotland, and the other was Professor David Bell from Stirling University. Professor David Bell is also a member of Scotland in Union, so I think we can guess where his emphasis will lie. I'm not going to give him airtime, but if you want to see what he has to say, go on the citizensassembly.scot website and you can get his burblings for yourself. The other speaker was Fraser McKinley from Audit Scotland. I'm going to play you a little clip out of his catch-up video. And I think this is much more insidious. I mean, we know where David Bell stands on things, but this is Audit Scotland. This is a public body. See what you think of this, and then we'll compare notes afterwards.
So when I spoke to you back in February, we talked mainly about the size of the Scottish budget and how that was spent. So you'll remember that last year the Scottish budget was just over £40 billion. And the biggest area of day-to-day spend in there is health, the NHS, followed by local government. We spoke a little bit about how that, where that money comes from and how it's collected. And you'll remember that still the biggest chunk of that money comes from the UK government through the thing called the block grant, which is transferred directly from the Treasury in London. But increasingly, the money that comes into Scotland is being raised in Scotland. So once all the new taxes that have been devolved to the Scottish Parliament are in place, the Scottish Government will raise approximately 20 billion. So about half the Scottish budget will be raised directly from Scottish taxpayers. So those were the main things we spoke about back in February. But as I say, it feels like that's a long time ago. A lot has changed. And in terms of the Scottish budget, the main thing that's changed is that there is more of it. In May, the Scottish Government updated the budget for 2020-2021, and that showed an increase of nearly £3 billion just in that 2 months. And there is every chance that there is more to come. There has been more spending announcements since then, and we expect there will be more to come. So a really significant increase in terms of the Scottish budget. And for example, that included an increase of about 620 million on health, and a really big increase in local government spend, up about 1.6 billion. Now, a lot of that has been things like grants to small businesses. So that really is local government just passing on money that's come from the UK, but really significant in terms of the increases in spend. Now, interestingly, most of that has come from the UK government. So most of that has come through what we call the Barnett formula and the block grant. And indeed, there's more to come, as I say. So the UK government at the end of July said that it was going to provide at least £6.5 billion to the Scottish Government overall to tackle COVID-19. So really significant amounts of spend. And of course, that's just the amount that's going to come through the block grant for the Scottish Government to spend. There's also been significant amounts of money spent by the UK government on a UK-wide basis. So, for example, the furlough scheme, which we've heard so much about over the last few years, is supporting nearly 900,000 people in Scotland. And that's money that's coming directly from the UK government, but not through the Scottish Government budget, if you like.
So did anyone else get the impression from that all the taxes raised in Scotland only go towards half of what Scotland spends and the rest is donated to us by a generous UK government? No mention of the fact that the block grant is actually a block rebate, where we get some of our own money back. No mention of where the UK government gets the money that they so generously donate to us, which we know is a combination of other taxes which aren't devolved to Scotland, and huge, eye-watering amounts of borrowing. The UK government is £2.4 trillion in debt at the moment and rising. So they're borrowing on our behalf, which is something we could do ourselves as an independent country. But also, still over half of the taxes collected in Scotland remain under the direct control of the UK Parliament. That includes corporation tax, national insurance, VAT, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, insurance taxes, motoring taxes. And although they're working on giving us a share of the VAT collected in Scotland, to have it presented in this way as just a straightforward fanfare for the UK government and its largesse, it sounds as if you'd have an immediate 50% cut on independence, which is just ridiculous. Now, it may have been that he had no intention of putting that across, but it does make you wonder. Let's just quickly remind ourselves of how Richard Murphy explained it.
Potential costs overstated, and we haven't got the credit for the tax on those costs credited to Scotland. We also have the income in Scotland understated, so the tax paid on that income in Scotland isn't the full tax that's owing in Scotland. So every single figure that you look at, you find is biased against Scotland.
When the weekend covering finances and budget was originally aired in the Citizens' Assembly, I did send them, I can't remember, I think it must have been an email, saying that I was concerned at their choice of speaker and that they both seemed to come from a very particular perspective. And I got no reply, which is disappointing. But I might just write again, given that they're revving up to get going again. If anybody else wants to have a listen to the update videos on the citizensassembly.scot page and thinks they're misleading, then please get in touch with the citizensassembly.scot and let them know what you think. My concern with this is that it taints a process which, apart from that, has been quite useful, and be a shame for us to discard some of the other findings that are coming out for it. But if you're leaving people with an inaccurate impression of what the situation is, you can't then expect them to come to sensible conclusions. And when they're hearing it from Audit Scotland, they're going to accept it as correct, but even just a cursory glance at ScotGov tells you which taxes are devolved. However, what I'm going to play though now is the audio from the fourth of the little videos, and it's to do with sustainability. And I found this the most uplifting of the Citizens' Assembly the first time round, and I also find it the most positive and the most interesting in terms of what the impact of COVID has been. So I'm going to play you that one. It's on YouTube. I'll share it into the Clacks WFI podcast folder on Indie Live Radio's YouTube channel. So if you want to have a look at the video, then you can.
I wonder if you could each just very quickly give us a very quick summary of the evidence and insights that you shared with the Assembly earlier in the year.
My starting point was to say that employability, employment at the heart of an inclusive economy, and that required different parties ranging from government, private sector, education, third sector to work differently to the way they've worked in the past. But also what would underpin a lot of that would be around fair work and things like living wage, so that we also started to deal with in-work poverty and make work fair for everyone, and also the need to do different things to really try and bring in the most disadvantaged people into the workplace. And one of my thoughts there was around government needing to reflect the fact is that it costs the public purse a lot of money to keep people unemployed and at home, versus how could we usefully engage them in work and I guess give them a purpose and give them skills and experience that would hopefully allow them to go on to more permanent work in the future. So that was at the thrust of my whole thinking around a much more inclusive economy and fair work.
One of the things I spoke about was the time to ask big questions about the nature of the economic model, that we've done things in Scotland and in the UK and around the world really with the same sort of processes and recipes over the last few decades, and that's not delivered the sort of quality of life that people in Scotland deserve and want. And we see that just with the persistence of poverty, the extent to which the Scottish economic model is not lifting people out of poverty, it's not supporting people, not enabling them to live good lives. And of course we were sitting in a hotel out in Clydebank, where just around the corner from where we were gathering in that dark January weekend, 1 in 3 children lived in poverty. And I think we need no stronger indictment of the urgent need to transform our economy than the persistence of social economic injustices. And the climate crisis and the environmental crisis basically gives us a ticking clock that we need to get our act together and start changing. And now COVID has given us this moment of transformation that we need to step into to bring about the changes we need to see.
What I was talking about was essentially how does Scotland deliver on its climate change targets. And this is not about whether climate change is happening. It's not about whether we should act, that's all been agreed. The issue is the how. How do we do it, given we have constrained resources, we have questions about the choices we make collectively as communities or as individuals, and what resources, what powers we can bring to bear on the problem. So the issues that I was talking about was looking at some of the really radical changes that we need to make to our homes, to our towns and cities and villages, to the way in which we work and play over the next 5-10 years. And I was making the point that although there are radical changes, in practice, we can start to look at where things actually really benefit us as well, more widely, picking up some of Catherine's points, some of Sandy's points around the sorts of work we do, around the choices we make around our health and well-being, which actually allows us to deliver some of these radical changes, this seemingly almost impossible things to do, actually are very achievable if we start to think much more seriously about how we reshape our cities, our towns, our villages to support this wider piece. And
if you could share with members a sense of how COVID and the crisis associated with it has impacted on your thinking across the areas you describe.
I think in many ways COVID has just brought into sharp focus the fact is that I guess a number of things. One is those who are most impacted by recessions will be even more impacted than they have been previously. And some of the forecasts around potential groups being impacted with unemployment, redundancy, etc., particularly because of the sectors that are hit hardest, is only really going to bring that into sharp focus. And we could be facing into outcomes that are far worse than we had in 2007, 2008. So we can't allow that to happen. I think secondly is that as a result of that, I do think we've got an opportunity to think more radically around how we both create opportunities for people, but secondly is also how they are then rewarded fairly. And I think things like the living wage, etc., could absolutely accelerate in its impact. I think the third thing as well is that we also need to think medium to long term about the kind of jobs that we need in Scotland, and particularly as it relates to the climate and environmental agenda. There's lots of things that need to be done in that space that we've not been able to progress because of lack of capacity and skills and experience. So the conversations I'm having through the work I'm doing with the Youth Guarantee is around how do we equip people with skills that actually are going to be not just relevant today, but for the next 5 or 10 years. And I'll give you a real example. The amount of time it would take to insulate in Scotland to the required standard would take anywhere up to 25 years previously, purely because of capacity issue. We don't have enough people to do it. An opportunity that there will be a number of people who will be looking for work to actually accelerate that whole agenda. So we do need to piece these things together in a much better way than we've done in the past. I do think COVID has drawn the sharp focus. The fact is that the vulnerable and most disadvantaged in our society are going to be even more impacted than they have previously.
In multiple ways, and in probably there'll be infinite number of ways we haven't yet got our heads around or anticipated. I think the ripple effects of COVID are just going to carry on, and we'll discover an impact just when we thought we had understood the full extent of the impact. And I think we need to be prepared for that and be prepared to be adaptive when we discover new impacts and new disconnects or new surprises. So we're going to have to carry sort of an open mind for many, many years to come now, as we're seeing the impact just flow on for many years. But I think a couple of key dimensions come to mind. One is just how the political space and the political orthodoxy has been smashed wide open. Governments now are bringing in policies that even 4 or 5 months ago I would have been dismissed as being naive or idealistic for proposing. And so we're seeing governments bring in things now that they would have never dreamed on, which means there is a terrain to ask these big questions, to suggest the sort of transformational projects that we need to wrap our heads around. And it shows us that big, urgent change at scale is possible. I mean, we've always said there needs to be massive transformation of our economy. And we were told that people wouldn't stop flying or people wouldn't change their transport. And yet we have seen when urgent change is required, it can happen. I think it's horrible that it's happened because of a pandemic. We'd never, ever wish this. But it does show the ability of humans to adapt and to very quickly wrap their heads around very different circumstances. I think we've also seen the willingness of governments around the world to put the health and well-being of their citizens ahead of short-term economic considerations. And I think that's a very, very powerful precedent. And we've seen opinion polls over the last few months showing that well over 80% of the UK public, and the figures are slightly higher in Scotland, that people support the continuation of putting health and wellbeing ahead of short-term economic growth priorities. I think we've also seen a discussion over what jobs really matter to us as communities, what jobs make the most difference to our community life, to our society, and people being aghast at the disconnect, the gap between how we support and pay for those jobs, the sort of job quality and the salaries of those jobs, and their huge impact on society. And I think finally, one of the other aspects that I think is really heartening is the discussion around conditionality on businesses receiving government support and bailouts. It's perhaps not as vigorous as we'd like, but things like the Scottish Parliament voting to not give business support to companies that are linked to tax havens. We've got the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, saying that any company receiving a government bailout should demonstrate its plan to reach the Paris target. So that is a huge precedent that we should ask more of businesses that are getting basically public sector taxpayers' support. I think that's a really great trend that we should keep going beyond COVID.
One of the points I was making in the Assembly in January was the challenge for Scotland was not just how do you meet climate targets, it's how do you meet climate targets whilst ensuring Scotland undergoes a just or a fair transition. In other words, that we have a socially fair transformation in terms of jobs, skills, qualities of local communities. Now, we were talking about a transition over years, 5, 10, 15 years. In practice, what COVID has done, and we're just starting to see it come through right now, is some shocking look at what's going to happen with jobs, and in particular in terms of loss of jobs across society, but in particular across particular strands of society that we didn't expect. It's particularly hitting hard on young people, particularly hitting hard on female workforce, particularly where you've got people tied with childcare and things like that. So actually just thinking about whole segments of the population that you're thinking, how do we actually take forward a transition where we can support those, but also to deliver the outcomes that we seek. So the big change for me with COVID coming in has been not just thinking about what happens over the next 5, 6, 7 years, but actually what happens over the next 5, 6, 7 months. And how do we put in place the skills, the capacities to actually move people away from 0 hours jobs, to move people away from a focus only on, say, retail and so on, to say, how do we actually build community wealth, local community wealth? How do we build and rethink the spaces that we're using? And so actually rethinking quite a lot about how we use space, how we use our resources, our assets, our buildings, our green space, and think about the jobs that are created through that. Because we know from many, many studies around the world that actually an awful lot of what we think of as green stimulus, energy efficiency improvements, improving the quality of homes, reshaping the spaces that we use, public spaces in urban environments, rethinking the supply chains within which we are using manufacturing or land use and so on, and how we shorten those. All of those we can do actually within the next few months and years, rather than thinking of them as something that we can do in 5, 10, 15 years. And that needs to be the focus for us. So it's very much focused on stitching together the challenge around jobs, which is going to be huge for this country, into how do we get the short-term piece right so that we're also delivering against this medium and long-term outcome that we're actually seeking. And that to me is the big change that we've seen from COVID is we've got to have a sort of laser-like focus on that labour market and how we can then build the places and the spaces and the communities and the business support that we need to make that happen.
As members move forward towards the end of their journey with the Assembly, what are the kind of key priorities around renewal in light of COVID that you'd really want them to focus on?
Under renewal, I think that there's a number of things on the back of COVID that will be accelerated. There were directions of travel that not only Scotland but other parts of the world were on. Some of the old economies and old industries that were in place before, oil and gas, for example, are in some ways the acceleration of the change in those sectors is going to be faster. So I think you need to think about what's the impact of the current sectors that play a big part in the Scottish economy. But secondly is how will some of the new businesses and sectors that are growing in importance how will they need to be accelerated and will accelerate as a result of this. So, example, as I say earlier on about the impact of environment and climate change, etc. So businesses that were looking to place some pretty significant investment into, for example, renewables and infrastructure. How do we encourage them to accelerate that and then create jobs on the back of it? So I think the future direction of the Scottish economy will change, but it will change faster than we probably anticipated because of COVID.
I mean, just building on what I've just said in terms of, for me, it's that how do we make sure that we've got the partnerships, the engagement that you need across civic, the business, the public sectors, to make sure that the stimulus that we're putting in place in the short term delivers the structural changes that we need in the medium and long term. Because what the one thing we do not want to do is repeat what happened 12 years ago when loads of public money was thrown after the financial crash and nothing changed structurally, and we've ended up essentially with the same situation but with higher levels of debt. Really, we need to be thinking much more about how do we ensure that the stimulus that we're putting in place, the apprenticeships, the training, the education, the reshaping public spaces, are all in purpose of delivering what we're trying to achieve, which is around both community wealth and business, local business wealth, community wealth. How do we ensure income is generated locally? How do we create the health and well-being piece? And how do we ensure then that we meet these medium-term climate targets? And it's trying to align that, and rather than sort of outsource everything or go back to, let's buy in the solution from somewhere else. It is about how do we build this locally around our communities, our towns, our cities, and the way we use our land and so on, and our buildings, so that we're actually shaping it in that thing. So you're stitching the short-term need to support jobs, skills, capabilities, the people resources we've got in this country, with this medium-term target that we want, which is the well-being target around climate.
And just building on Andy's point there around the purpose of all this infrastructure, our businesses and so on, one of the areas, I think, one of the leverage points, or I guess changes that we need to focus on is how do we define what the purpose of the economy is about? Because if we get that right, a lot of the other policy changes are much easier. They'll fall into place afterwards because they'll seek to promote that purpose for the economy. So that's why I often retreat or turn back to what is it that we're measuring our economy by? It's not just a geeky conversation. This is literally telling us what is the most important goal for our economic system. And since COVID, a lot of people have been talking about the need to build back better, which comes from the humanitarian sector. Often humanitarian colleagues of mine, when I used to work for a big international NGO, they would talk about, after a disaster had struck, the need to build back better. And sadly, that applies so appropriately to what comes out of COVID. Do we return to an economic system that on so many levels wasn't working, or do we try to create something that's better than what we had before? And so we will only be able to tell if we are building back better if we have more appropriate measures of progress. If we're just measuring renewal or recovery by gross domestic product per capita, we won't know if we've reduced inequality. We won't know if the jobs are better quality. We won't know if we're sufficiently protecting the environment, because GDP is blind to so many of those considerations. So if we're really going to build back better, we need to wrap our heads around the elevation of different measures of progress. And Scotland's fortunate because it's taken a few steps in the right direction. And I'm sure you've discussed at the Assembly the National Performance Framework. That's a good example of setting out a different suite of measures that we should really use to run the ruler across the measures and the policies and the changes that are coming out as we emerge from COVID, and really testing them against a much more appropriate suite of goals than just narrowly focusing on gross domestic product.
And now we're going to have the latest poem from birthday girl Lorraine, and this I think is her best so far. It's called Ghost Hills.
Poem by me, Lorraine Sinclair. in awe of the Ochils. For centuries they have inspired the locals, the beautiful magical ghost towns. Our ancestors roamed there a long, long time ago, hunted deer, sheltered from storms, and hid from many a foe. The Picts and the Gaels, freedom fighters as well. Oh, if only we knew what stories they could tell. Of battles hard fought and won, of Scottish soldiers who camped there, our heroes, every one. In awe of the Ochils, the beautiful greenest ghost hills. Wallace based his army here and spied upon Stirling town, plotting when best to bring his warriors down. I swear, on a dark winter's night, the Ochils echoes cries of freedom, of brave men running to the fight. In the midst of summer and blooming purple heather, I imagine Jacobites being cleansed in good Scottish weather. In love with the Ochils, unchanged since time began, I look at them and wonder and awe, and admire the view our ancestors saw. And sure, on a cool autumn evening, I can hear birds tweet codes from your era, used as you navigated strange landscapes, often in fear and terror. In the greenest of spring, what a wonderful sight. I oft remember the pagans who worshipped in your glens at night. In awe of the Ochils, the most beautiful, greenest, mystical, magical ghost towns.
So that's about it for this week. I hope you enjoyed our delve into poetry. No virtual coffee shop this week, partly because lives are getting busy again, but also because I managed to make a mess of setting up the Zoom for the meeting and put a password on it that I couldn't take off again. So hopefully we'll be back to normal next week, and hopefully somebody more competent than me will take over the Zoom arrangements. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye now.